Chapter 1. The morning everything broke. The Pacific Ocean was calm that morning. From the wide glass windows of the Malibu mansion, the horizon stretched endlessly, the early sunlight glittering on the water like scattered diamonds. Waves rolled slowly toward the private stretch of beach below the cliffs, their quiet rhythm filling the silence of the house. Inside the kitchen, everything felt perfectly still. The marble countertops shined beneath soft golden light. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air. A single plate of eggs and toast sat untouched on the breakfast table. At the head of that table sat Harrison Clark. At 70 years old, Harrison was a man whose name carried weight in cities across America. For 4 decades, he had built an empire in real estate, towers in New York, luxury properties in California, commercial developments across half the country. People called him ruthless in business, disciplined, unbreakable. But this morning, he looked like nothing more than an old man enjoying a quiet breakfast. He wore a simple navy sweater and reading glasses as he flipped through the financial section of a newspaper. A cup of black coffee rested near his right hand. The house was unusually quiet. Too quiet. Harrison noticed it in the way only someone who had lived somewhere for years could. The absence of sound felt strange. Usually by now, the housekeeper would be moving around the hallway. Leo would be upstairs getting ready for school, and Veronica would be downstairs scrolling through her phone while complaining about something trivial. But today there was only silence. Harrison took a slow sip of coffee and glanced toward the ocean again. Strange, he thought. Then he heard footsteps, soft at first, then louder as they approached the kitchen. He didn't look up immediately, but when the footsteps stopped beside the table, Harrison slowly lowered the newspaper. Standing across from him was Veronica Clark. Even after 12 years of marriage, she still had the kind of presence that drew attention. At 48, she was elegant and striking, dressed perfectly even this early in the morning. Her long dark hair fell neatly over her shoulders. She wore a white silk blouse and black slacks, as if she were about to leave for an important meeting. But what Harrison noticed most wasn't her appearance. It was the folder in her hand, a thin manila folder. Veronica didn't greet him. She didn't smile. She simply stepped forward and dropped the folder onto the table. The sound of paper hitting marble echoed sharply through the kitchen. Harrison frowned slightly. "What's this?" Veronica crossed her arms calmly. "Open it." Her voice was flat, emotionless. Harrison studied her face for a moment. There was no warmth there, no irritation, just cold certainty. Slowly, Harrison reached forward and opened the folder. The moment his eyes scanned the first page, he felt the faintest tightening in his chest. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Divorce papers. Harrison read the title again, just to be sure. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair and looked up at her. "Divorce?" he asked quietly. Veronica didn't flinch. "Yes." No explanation. No hesitation. Just that single word. Harrison closed the folder slowly, resting both hands on top of it. The ocean outside continued its quiet rhythm. "You're serious," he said. "I wouldn't bring lawyers' paperwork to breakfast as a joke." He studied her carefully now. There was something calculated in her posture, something rehearsed, like she had already played this conversation out in her head many times. "What's the reason?" Harrison asked. Veronica shrugged slightly. "I'm bored." For a moment, Harrison actually thought he had misheard her. "Bored?" "Yes," she repeated. "With the marriage. With this house. With this life." She gestured vaguely toward the enormous windows overlooking the ocean. "I want something different." Harrison stared at her. After 40 years of negotiating billion-dollar deals, he had learned how to read people. But right now, he couldn't read her at all. "So that's it?" he asked quietly. Veronica pulled out a chair across from him and sat down. "That's it." Harrison opened the folder again. This time he flipped past the first page. The next document was far more detailed, and as he read it, his expression slowly hardened. Property division. Asset demands. Line after line. He read them aloud slowly. The Malibu house. Veronica nodded. "Yes." The Tribeca penthouse in New York. "Yes." My vintage Porsche collection. "Yes." The art collection. "Yes." Harrison turned the page. and $5 million in cash. Yes. Her voice never changed. It remained calm, casual, like she was discussing dinner plans. Harrison closed the folder again. Nearly 80% of his personal wealth. That was what she was asking for. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her. You're asking for quite a lot. Veronica gave a small smile. You can afford it. That's not the point, isn't it? The silence between them stretched for several seconds. Outside, a seagull cried somewhere over the ocean. Harrison tapped his fingers lightly on the folder. You've clearly thought this through. Of course I have. And your lawyer believes you're entitled to all this? My lawyer believes you'll agree to it. Harrison raised an eyebrow. And why would he believe that? Veronica leaned back comfortably in her chair. Because you hate public fights. She wasn't wrong. Harrison Clark had built a reputation for quiet control. He avoided scandals, avoided messy public disputes. But that wasn't what was bothering him right now. There was only one thing he hadn't seen mentioned anywhere in the paperwork. So he asked the question that mattered most. What about Leo? The moment the name left his mouth, Veronica's expression changed slightly. Not with sadness, not with hesitation, with irritation. She waved a hand dismissively. You keep him. Harrison blinked. I'm sorry. You heard me. Her voice turned sharper now. I'm not interested in raising a 16-year-old boy. Harrison stared at her. Leo is our son. He's your son now. That's not how this works. Veronica sighed impatiently. Look, Harrison, I'm 48. I want to travel. I want freedom. I want a life that doesn't revolve around teenage mood swings and school meetings. You're his mother, and I'm done being one. The words fell into the room like stones. Harrison felt something cold settle in his chest. You're serious. Completely. She leaned forward slightly. You keep the boy. I take the assets. Everyone gets what they want. Harrison didn't respond immediately, because at that exact moment, something neither of them noticed was happening just outside the kitchen. Down the hallway, 16-year-old Leo Clark had stopped walking. He had been heading toward the stairs when he heard his name. Now he stood frozen beside the wall, hidden from view, and every word was reaching him. You keep him. The sentence echoed in his head. His chest tightened. His mother's voice drifted down the hallway again. He's a burden, Harrison. You know it as well as I do. Leo felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Inside the kitchen, Harrison sat completely still. He stared at the woman across from him. The woman he had once believed loved their family. The woman who had just dismissed their son like an unwanted possession. Something inside him shifted. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was colder than that. Calmer. A quiet realization settling into place. He looked at Veronica one last time, and in that moment, Harrison Clark stopped seeing her as his wife. He began seeing her as his enemy. Chapter 2, The Lawyer's Shock. The office of Sarah Jenkins sat on the 32nd floor of a sleek glass tower in downtown Los Angeles. From the outside, the building looked like every other corporate skyscraper lining the skyline. But inside the legal world, Sarah's firm carried a very different reputation. People didn't come to Sarah Jenkins when they wanted peace. They came to her when they wanted war. Her colleagues called her the Iron Maiden. Judges respected her. Opposing attorneys feared her. And wealthy clients trusted her to tear apart anyone who tried to take what belonged to them. That morning, sunlight poured through the massive windows behind her desk, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The room was minimalist, dark with shelves, leather chairs, and neatly stacked legal files arranged with almost obsessive precision. Sarah sat behind her desk, scanning a document with narrowed eyes. Across from her sat Harrison Clark. Unlike the tense atmosphere inside the office, Harrison appeared strangely calm. He sat quietly in the leather chair, hands resting on the polished table, watching Sarah read. The thick folder in front of her contained everything Veronica had demanded in the divorce. And the longer Sarah read, the more her expression hardened. Finally, she dropped the papers onto the desk with a sharp slap. This is outrageous. Her voice carried the kind of controlled anger that made junior associates nervous. She flipped the top page back toward Harrison and pointed at the list. The Malibu Mansion? Harrison nodded once. Yes. Sarah turned another page. The Tribeca Penthouse? Yes. Her finger continued down the list. The Porsche collection, the art portfolio, $5 million in cash. She leaned back in her chair, incredulous. She's asking for nearly 80% of your personal assets. Harrison remained silent. Sarah shook her head slowly. This is not a negotiation. This is a robbery. She grabbed a pen and began scribbling notes across the margins of the document. First of all, she said sharply, most of these properties were acquired before your marriage. That makes them separate assets. She flipped another page. The penthouse in New York is owned through one of your development companies. She has zero claim to that. Another note. And the Porsche collection is registered under your private investment trust. Sarah leaned forward across the desk, eyes locked on Harrison. This case is easy. Harrison raised an eyebrow slightly. Easy. Very easy, she said firmly. She tapped the papers again. I can dismantle this entire demand list in one hearing. Her voice grew sharper as she spoke. She's relying on intimidation. She thinks you'll fold to avoid a public fight. Harrison said nothing. Sarah stood up from her chair and began pacing slowly behind the desk. I've been doing divorce law for 23 years, she continued. And I can tell you right now, she doesn't have the leverage she thinks she does. She turned to face him. If you want, we can file a response this afternoon. What kind of response? Harrison asked quietly. The kind that makes her regret filing these papers in the first place. Sarah's eyes flashed with confidence. We challenge the asset claims. Freeze the property transfers. Demand a forensic audit of her spending. She stopped pacing and leaned forward against the desk. And if she pushes back, Sarah gave a cold smile. Then we bury her in litigation until she runs out of money. For a moment, the room was silent. The city traffic hummed faintly outside the window. Sarah waited for Harrison to respond. Instead, he simply picked up the top page of the divorce papers and studied it again. What about Leo? He asked. Sarah frowned slightly. The custody situation? Yes. Well, she said, sitting down again. Based on the documents, she's not requesting custody. I noticed. Sarah shrugged. That actually strengthens your position. Courts favor stability. If she's voluntarily stepping away from parenting responsibilities, that makes full custody straightforward. Harrison nodded slowly. Sarah leaned forward again, her voice steady and professional. Harrison, this is a fight you will win. She pushed the papers aside. We just need to decide how aggressively you want to pursue it. For several seconds, Harrison didn't respond. He simply stared out the window behind her. The city stretched endlessly below them, cars crawling along highways, sunlight reflecting off glass towers. Finally, he spoke. Give it to her. Sarah blinked. I'm sorry. Harrison turned back toward her calmly. Give her everything she asked for. For a moment, Sarah thought she had misunderstood. The mansion, Harrison continued. Sarah stared at him. The cars. Her mouth opened slightly. The art. Now she looked genuinely confused. And the money. The silence that followed was heavy. Sarah leaned back slowly in her chair, studying him carefully. You're joking. I'm not. She shook her head immediately. No, absolutely not. Harrison, give it to her. This time his voice was firm. Sarah stood up again, disbelief written across her face. Do you have any idea what you're saying? Yes. You're talking about tens of millions of dollars. I know. You built this empire over 40 years. I'm aware. Sarah walked around the desk and stopped directly in front of him. This is insane. Her tone softened slightly, shifting from anger to concern. Harrison, I know divorce is emotional, but making a decision like this out of shock or guilt, this isn't emotional. She crossed her arms. Then explain it to me. Harrison didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and removed a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the desk toward her. I do have one condition. Sarah glanced down at the paper. Her eyes scanned the text quickly. Then she looked back up at him. This is a parental rights waiver. Yes. She read further. It terminates Veronica's legal relationship with Leo. Yes. Her brow furrowed. It gives you full and permanent custody. Yes. She continued reading. And it prevents her from making any future legal claims involving Leo or his inheritance. Harrison nodded once. That's correct. Sarah set the document down slowly. You're willing to hand over 80% of your wealth in exchange for this? Yes. But she already said she doesn't want custody. This makes it permanent. Sarah stared at him. What? The question hung in the air. Harrison folded his hands together calmly. Because I don't want her coming back 10 years from now, demanding money from him. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. You think she would? I know she would. The room went quiet again. Sarah walked back to her chair and sat down slowly. For the first time since the meeting began, she looked uncertain. You're trading an empire, she said carefully. Harrison didn't respond. Sarah leaned forward, studying him closely. What? For a long moment, Harrison Clark said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. Because some things matter more than money. Chapter 3, Veronica's Greed. The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive coffee. It was one of the private legal meeting rooms inside Sarah Jenkins' law firm, designed for negotiations that involved powerful people and even larger amounts of money. The long walnut table in the center of the room gleamed beneath the ceiling lights, surrounded by black leather chairs arranged with perfect symmetry. Large windows overlooked downtown Los Angeles, but no one in the room paid attention to the view. This was not a meeting about scenery. This was a meeting about division, and everyone sitting around the table understood exactly what was at stake. On one side sat Harrison Clark, calm and composed as always. His posture was relaxed, his hands folded neatly on the table in front of him. Beside him sat Sarah Jenkins, the woman many attorneys quietly feared in courtrooms across California. Across from them sat Veronica Clark. She looked radiant. Her dark hair was styled perfectly, and she wore a fitted designer dress that seemed chosen specifically to remind everyone in the room that she had already mentally stepped into a new life. A life without Harrison. Beside her sat her attorney, a sharply dressed man named David Klein, whose confident smirk suggested he believed this negotiation was already finished. Veronica leaned back in her chair, comfortably, glancing around the room as if she were attending a social lunch rather than dissolving a marriage. Well, David Klein said cheerfully, flipping open a folder in front of him. Shall we begin? Sarah Jenkins didn't smile. We've reviewed your demands, she said evenly. David nodded. And Sarah slid a stack of papers across the table toward Harrison. All assets listed are outlined here. Malibu property, Tribeca penthouse, automotive collection, art holdings, and liquid cash transfer. David looked pleased. That matches our proposal. He turned slightly toward Veronica. See, I told you this would be straightforward. Veronica's lips curled into a satisfied smile. She glanced at Harrison, studying his face. She expected tension, maybe anger, maybe humiliation. But Harrison's expression remained calm, almost unreadable. David leaned back in his chair. So, Mr. Clark, he said lightly, do you have any revisions to the settlement proposal? Harrison glanced briefly at Sarah. She remained silent, though the tension in her shoulders suggested she still didn't approve of what he was about to say. Then Harrison looked back at David. No revisions. David blinked once. I'm sorry. Harrison folded his hands together. We accept your proposal. For a moment, the room went completely still. Veronica's eyebrows lifted slightly. David laughed softly. Well, that was easier than expected. He turned to Veronica again. Congratulations. Veronica's smile widened. She leaned forward slightly, looking directly at Harrison now. Smart decision, she said casually. Harrison didn't react. David flipped through the paperwork quickly, almost as if he couldn't believe the negotiation was ending so easily. Let's just confirm everything, he said. He began reading aloud. The Malibu residence will transfer fully to Mrs. Clark. Yes, Harrison said. The Tribeca penthouse in New York. Yes. The Porsche collection. Yes. The art holdings. Yes. David looked up with clear amusement. And $5 million in cash. Yes. Veronica let out a small, satisfied laugh. Wow. She leaned back in her chair again. I expected more of a fight. Sarah Jenkins remained completely silent, though the tension in her jaw suggested she was forcing herself not to intervene. David closed the folder with a pleased nod. Well then, he said, This may be the smoothest settlement meeting I've ever attended. But before he could continue, Harrison spoke again. I do have one condition. The words immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. David paused. Veronica frowned slightly. A condition? David asked. Yes. Harrison reached into his briefcase and removed a single document. He slid it across the table toward Veronica's side. This must be signed along with the settlement. David picked up the paper and scanned it quickly. As he read, his expression shifted slightly. Veronica leaned forward impatiently. What is it? David hesitated. It's a parental waiver. Veronica rolled her eyes immediately. Oh, for God's sake. David continued reading. It terminates your parental rights to Leo. Veronica waved her hand dismissively. That's fine. David looked up at her. You should probably read. I don't need to read it. She reached across the table and grabbed the document from him. Look, she said impatiently. I already told Harrison he can keep the kid. David frowned. This makes it legally permanent. Good. She barely glanced at the page. To be clear, Sarah Jenkins finally spoke, her voice cool and precise. Signing that document means you will have no legal relationship with Leo Clark moving forward. Veronica shrugged. That's the idea. You would not have visitation rights. Fine. You would not have parental authority. Fine. You would not be able to claim support, inheritance influence, or future legal connection. Veronica sighed loudly. Sarah, is there a point to this interrogation? Sarah met her gaze calmly. Yes. I want to make sure you understand what you're signing. Veronica leaned forward, picking up the pen resting on the table. I understand perfectly. She flipped to the signature page. To be honest, she said casually, this actually works out better for me. David looked uneasy now. Veronica, but she had already begun signing. Her pen moved quickly across the page. Her signature was smooth and confident. No hesitation, no pause, no second thoughts. She pushed the document back across the table. There, she said. That wasn't so hard. Harrison looked down at the signed paper. For a brief moment, something flickered behind his calm expression, but it vanished almost instantly. Sarah picked up the document and examined it carefully. The signature was clear, legally binding. She placed it into the folder slowly. Well, David said awkwardly, adjusting his tie, that settles that. Veronica looked extremely pleased with herself. She folded her arms and smiled at Harrison. You know, she said, I really thought you'd drag this out. Harrison said nothing. David began organizing the remaining documents. We'll finalize the asset transfer filings and submit them to the court this week, he said. Sarah nodded. Everything will be processed accordingly. Veronica stood up from her chair, smoothing her dress. I have to say, she said cheerfully, this went better than I expected. She glanced at Harrison one last time. Thank you for being reasonable. Harrison remained seated, silent, watching. The meeting slowly dissolved as the lawyers gathered the documents and closed their folders. No one else in the room seemed to notice the quiet shift that had just taken place. But in that moment, with a single careless signature, Veronica had unknowingly done something far more significant than finalize a divorce agreement. She had sold her relationship with her own son for money. The lawyers finalized the paperwork. And somewhere beneath the surface of the agreement, unseen by everyone except Harrison Clark, the trap was now quietly in place. Chapter 4. The Secret Harrison Never Revealed. 3 days after the settlement meeting, the story of Harrison Clark's humiliating divorce had already begun circulating through the quiet networks of wealth and influence. In private clubs, in real estate boardrooms, in whispered conversations between attorneys who had once admired Harrison's ruthless negotiating style. The story was always told the same way. The powerful billionaire had been taken apart by his own wife. She walked away with everything. That man built half the skyline in 3 cities and still folded. I guess age finally caught up with him. No one understood why Harrison had surrendered so easily. Not the investors who had trusted him for decades. Not the business rivals who had feared his calculating mind. And certainly not Sarah Jenkins, who sat behind her office desk staring at the finalized settlement documents like they were a puzzle she couldn't solve. The Iron Maiden was not used to losing. Yet here she was, holding papers that legally transferred millions of dollars worth of property away from her client. The Malibu mansion, the Tribeca penthouse, the cars, the art. She rubbed her temple and sighed. Across the desk, Harrison sat quietly as usual, watching the late afternoon sunlight drift through the window. "You do realize," Sarah finally said, tapping the folder, "every lawyer in Los Angeles thinks you've lost your mind." Harrison didn't react. "That's fine." Sarah studied him carefully. "You've built a career destroying people in negotiations." "Yes. And yet this time you simply handed everything over." "Yes." Her frustration grew. "Harrison, I need to ask you something honestly." He looked at her. "Go ahead." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Did Veronica scare you somehow?" For the first time, Harrison almost smiled. "No, then what is this?" She gestured to the settlement documents. "Because I know you. And this," she tapped the paper again, "this doesn't look like surrender. It looks like something else." Harrison looked down at the papers for a moment. Then he slowly reached into his briefcase. From inside, he pulled out a slim black folder. "Do you remember something called the Phoenix Trust?" he asked. Sarah frowned slightly. "The Phoenix Trust," she leaned back, thinking. "Yes," she said slowly. "Your long-term real estate holding structure." Harrison nodded. "I created it 20 years ago." Sarah crossed her arms. "I remember reviewing it briefly when we reorganized your companies 10 years back. It was designed for asset protection." "Yes." Trust structures were common among the ultra-wealthy. They protected property from lawsuits, tax complications, and unpredictable financial disasters. But Sarah wasn't sure why Harrison was bringing it up now. "What does that have to do with this divorce?" she asked. Harrison opened a folder and slid several documents across the desk. "Take a closer look." Sarah picked them up and began scanning the pages. The first document listed properties tied to the trust. She read them automatically. Commercial development plots, investment land holdings, a few residential structures. Then her eyes paused. She flipped back to the beginning. "Wait." Her finger tapped two specific entries. "The Malibu property." Harrison nodded once. "And," she turned another page, "the land beneath the Tribeca building." Her eyes slowly lifted toward him. "These are listed under the Phoenix Trust." "Yes." Sarah frowned. "But the divorce settlement transfers those buildings to Veronica." "Correct." Her confusion deepened. "That doesn't make sense." Harrison leaned back in his chair. "Keep reading." Sarah turned to the next section of the documents. At first it looked like standard legal language. Then she noticed something unusual. A clause labeled ground lease agreement. Her eyes moved quickly across the page now. 25-year lease. She looked back up. "These properties sit on leased land?" "Yes." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "The trust owns the land?" "Yes." A slow realization began forming in her mind. Meaning, the structures themselves are technically separate assets. "Yes." Sarah leaned forward again, suddenly focused. "So, the Malibu mansion sits on land owned by the trust?" "Yes." "And the Tribeca building is built on land owned by the trust?" "Yes." She flipped another page, reading faster now. The lease agreements detailed specific dates, terms, financial conditions. Her eyes stopped on the expiration clause. Then she froze. Her voice dropped. "Harrison," he waited calmly. "These leases," she swallowed slightly, "expire in 24 hours. Harrison nodded slowly. "The day after the divorce finalization." Sarah stared at him. "You're telling me." Her voice trailed off as the full implication crashed into her mind. She sat back slowly in her chair. Oh my God. For the first time since she had known him, Sarah Jenkins looked genuinely stunned. "So, when Veronica receives the mansion," Harrison finished the thought for her, "she receives the building, but not the land." "Correct." Sarah looked down at the documents again. "And without land rights, the structure becomes a liability." Her mind raced through the legal consequences. If the lease expires and the trust refuses renewal, the property becomes unauthorized occupancy. Sarah shook her head slowly. "That means she technically owns a structure sitting on property she has no legal right to use." "Yes." "And the trust can charge whatever lease fee it wants." "Yes." Sarah let out a quiet laugh of disbelief. This is insane. Harrison said nothing. She leaned forward again, studying him like she had just discovered a completely new person. You planned this 20 years ago. Harrison shrugged slightly. I planned a trust structure 20 years ago, but the timing of the lease expiration was deliberate. Sarah stared at him. You knew this day might come. I prepare for possibilities. Her voice softened now. And Veronica never noticed? No. And her lawyer didn't catch it? No. Sarah leaned back again, shaking her head slowly. They think they took everything. Harrison looked toward the window. Outside, the city skyline glowed in the orange light of sunset. Yes, he said quietly. Sarah glanced back at the documents one last time. Without land rights, the buildings would become massive financial problems. Maintenance, taxes, insurance, all sitting on land the owner didn't control. She looked at Harrison again. You're not renewing the leases. His answer came without hesitation. No. And Harrison had already decided the leases will not be renewed. Chapter 5. The day Harrison leaves. The moving trucks hadn't even arrived yet when Veronica Clark began redecorating. Late afternoon sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Malibu mansion, lighting up the vast living room where workers were already rolling up rugs and measuring walls. The sound of tape measures snapping and furniture scraping echoed through the halls. Veronica stood in the center of the room with a tablet in her hand, flipping through design photos. No, she said sharply to one of the workers. That sofa goes. I want something modern there. White leather. The man nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. She turned to another worker. And those paintings come down tonight. I'm bringing in a new collection next week. The man hesitated. Ma'am, those look expensive. Veronica smiled coldly. They are, but they're also outdated. Across the room, a few suitcases sat near the front door. 2 of them belonged to Harrison Clark. The third belonged to Leo. Harrison stood near the window, watching the ocean one last time. The waves rolled toward the cliffs, just like they had every morning for the past decade. The same quiet rhythm that had once made this house feel peaceful. Now it just felt distant. Behind him, Veronica's voice cut through the air again. You'll need to clear your things out tonight. Harrison turned slowly. I thought we had until the end of the week. Veronica shrugged. I'd rather not drag this out. Her tone suggested she was doing him a favor. I have people coming tomorrow to start renovations. Harrison nodded once. That's fine. Leo stood near the staircase, arms crossed tightly over his chest. He had been silent most of the day, watching strangers walk through his home like it was already someone else's property. In a way, it was. One of the workers carried a lamp past him and almost bumped into the banister. Careful, Leo snapped. The worker muttered an apology and hurried away. Leo turned toward his mother. You didn't waste any time. Veronica didn't look up from her tablet. Business moves quickly. Leo laughed bitterly. This isn't business. That finally made her glance at him. It is to me. Leo stared at her. Wow. Harrison stepped closer to his son. But Leo shook his head. No, Dad. Let her talk. He turned back to Veronica. You couldn't even wait a week before kicking us out. Veronica rolled her eyes slightly. You're not being kicked out. Your father agreed to the settlement. Leo looked at Harrison again. Yeah, I noticed. His voice carried the kind of sharp anger that only teenagers could summon. Harrison didn't respond. Instead, he picked up one of the suitcases and zipped it closed. Get your things together, he said quietly to Leo. We'll be leaving soon. Leo stared at him like he had just spoken another language. Leaving? Yes. Leo gestured around the massive house. This is our home. Not anymore. The words hung heavy in the air. Leo looked like he might argue again, but something in Harrison's calm tone stopped him. He turned and stormed up the stairs instead. His footsteps echoed through the house. Veronica watched him go with mild irritation. He's dramatic. Harrison said nothing. Several minutes passed while the workers continued measuring and moving things around. Eventually, Leo came back downstairs carrying a small backpack and a box. His expression was tight with frustration. He placed the box near the suitcases. What's in there? Harrison asked. My stuff. Harrison nodded. Leo hesitated, then looked toward the far corner of the living room. There, against the wall near the tall windows, sat a polished black piano. It was an old instrument, though it's slightly worn with age. Leo walked toward it slowly. Harrison followed his gaze. The piano had belonged to Harrison's father. For years it had sat quietly in the house, rarely used but never moved. Leo rested his hand gently on the keys. A soft note echoed through the room. He turned toward Veronica. "I'm taking this." Veronica barely glanced at it. "No," Leo blinked. "What?" "I said no." Leo stepped closer to the piano. "It's Grandpa's, and you know what it means to Dad." Veronica shrugged. "It's part of the house." Harrison walked over slowly. "Veronica," but she cut him off. "The house belongs to me now." Leo's jaw tightened. "It's a piano. It's property. It's family." Veronica finally looked directly at him. "It stays." Leo stared at her, disbelief spreading across his face. "You're serious?" "Yes." Leo looked at Harrison. "Dad." For a brief moment, the room felt completely still. Harrison glanced at the piano. Then he looked back at Leo. "It's okay," he said quietly. Leo frowned. "No, it's not." Harrison placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "We don't need it." Leo pulled away. "Yes, we do." His voice rose with frustration. "That piano belonged to Grandpa." Veronica sighed loudly. "If you're done being sentimental, I'd like to finish my day." Leo looked like he might explode. Instead, he grabbed his backpack and walked toward the front door. "Forget it." Harrison picked up the suitcases. Without another word, he followed his son outside. The evening air was cool as they stepped onto the driveway. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt. For a moment, Harrison turned back toward the house. The mansion stood tall against the sunset, golden light reflecting off its windows. A place that had once been home. Now it was just another building. He opened the trunk of the car and placed the suitcases inside. Leo climbed into the passenger seat without speaking. The drive away from Malibu was quiet. The highway lights flickered past as the car moved farther from the ocean. Neither of them spoke for nearly an hour. Finally, Harrison turned into a narrow street lined with older apartment buildings. The structures were small, plain, nothing like the luxury estates they had lived in before. Leo looked out the window. "You're kidding." Harrison parked beside the curb. "This is temporary." Leo stared at the faded building. Peeling paint covered the walls. A flickering hallway light buzzed above the entrance. "This is where we're living. For now." Leo stepped out of the car slowly, looking around like he had landed in a different world. They carried the bags up a narrow staircase to the second floor. The apartment door creaked open. Inside, the space was small. 2 rooms, old furniture, a worn couch. Leo dropped his backpack onto the floor. "This is insane." Harrison set the suitcases down. "We'll manage." Leo turned toward him suddenly. "What?" Harrison looked up. "Why what? Why did you let her do this?" His voice cracked slightly with anger. "You just gave her everything." Harrison didn't answer. Leo's frustration boiled over. "You built all that. The house, the cars, everything." Still no response. Leo threw his hands in the air. "You didn't even fight." Harrison looked at him calmly. Leo shook his head in disbelief. "You know what?" he snapped. "What?" Leo's eyes burned with anger. "You're a coward." The word hung heavily in the room. Harrison said nothing. He simply stood there quietly, absorbing the insult, because telling the truth too early could destroy the plan. Chapter 6: Veronica's New Life. 2 weeks after the divorce settlement, the Malibu mansion looked completely different. Where elegant classical furniture had once filled the rooms, sleek modern designs now dominated the space. White leather couches replaced dark antique wood. Crystal chandeliers were swapped for minimalist lighting fixtures that cast cool, soft glows across the marble floors. Workers moved constantly through the house. Interior designers, art consultants, delivery crews bringing in expensive new pieces of furniture. Veronica stood in the center of the living room, sipping a glass of champagne as she inspected the transformation. "No, no," she said to one of the decorators. "That sculpture should face the ocean. It needs better lighting." The man adjusted it immediately. "Yes, Miss Clark." Veronica smiled. She liked the sound of that. Ms. Clark, no longer tied to Harrison, no longer part of a marriage that had begun to feel stale years ago. Now, she had the freedom she had always wanted. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A text message appeared. Adrian, tennis at 4? Veronica's smile widened. Adrian Morales was 29 years old, athletic, charming, and tan in the effortless way that came from living near the beach. He had started as her private tennis instructor at the Malibu Club nearly a year earlier. Back then, their conversations had been innocent. Lessons, light jokes, the occasional drink after a match. But the moment the divorce papers were filed, the dynamic had changed quickly. Now, Adrian visited the mansion regularly, and Veronica made sure people saw him. She typed back quickly, "Veronica, only if you're bringing wine afterward." She slipped her phone into her purse and turned toward the glass doors that opened onto the backyard terrace. The infinity pool sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. For a moment, she stood there admiring the view. This is mine now, she thought. The house, the land, the life. Everything she had once shared with Harrison was now hers alone, and she had no intention of living quietly. That weekend, she hosted her first party. Luxury cars lined the long driveway as guests arrived one after another. Friends from charity boards, wealthy neighbors, and socialites who had always enjoyed the glamorous side of Veronica's life. Music played through hidden speakers across the patio. Servers carried trays of champagne and cocktails through the crowd. Veronica stood near the pool in a red evening dress, greeting guests as they arrived. "You look incredible," one of her friends said as they hugged. "Divorce suits you." Veronica laughed. "It's amazing what happens when you drop 200 pounds of dead weight." The group laughed with her. "Seriously," another woman said, "we were all wondering how you put up with him so long." Veronica lifted her champagne glass. "Patience." A man near the bar leaned toward another guest. "Isn't that the guy she's dating?" Across the patio, Adrian stood talking with a group of Veronica's friends. His casual white shirt and relaxed confidence made him stand out in the crowd. Veronica walked over and slipped her arm through his. "Everyone," she said with a playful smile, "this is Adrian." Adrian grinned. "The tennis instructor?" someone asked. Veronica laughed. "Among other things." The crowd chuckled knowingly. Adrian leaned closer to her ear. "You enjoy the attention." Veronica took a sip of champagne. "Of course I do." Across the patio, a few guests whispered quietly. She replaced a 70-year-old billionaire with a tennis coach. Good for her. She still got the money. Veronica heard the whispers but didn't care. In fact, she liked them. The entire evening felt like a celebration. Music, drinks, laughter, freedom. Late that night, after most of the guests had left, Veronica stood alone on the terrace looking out over the dark ocean. Adrian wrapped his arms around her from behind. "You're enjoying this," he said. She smiled. "You have no idea." "What about Harrison?" She shrugged. "What about him? You don't feel bad?" Veronica laughed softly. "Not even a little." Weeks passed quickly. Her new lifestyle settled into a comfortable rhythm. Shopping trips to Beverly Hills. Spa days with friends. Afternoons at the tennis club. And Adrian appearing beside her more and more often. People talked about them constantly. But Veronica loved the attention. One evening, she and Adrian decided to have dinner at one of Malibu's most exclusive restaurants. The place was known for its oceanfront tables and celebrity clientele. As they walked inside, the hostess greeted Veronica immediately. "Good evening, Miss Clark." She led them toward a table near the window. But as Veronica passed the bar area, she suddenly stopped walking, because sitting alone at a small table near the corner was someone she recognized instantly. Harrison. He looked older somehow. His clothes were simpler than the tailored suits he used to wear. In front of him sat a half-finished plate of food and a glass of water. For a moment, Veronica just stared. Then a slow smile spread across her face. "Well," she said quietly to Adrian. "Look who it is." Adrian followed her gaze. "That's him." "Yes." Veronica turned and walked toward Harrison's table. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor. Harrison looked up as she approached. His expression didn't change. Well, Veronica said lightly. "Enjoying dinner alone?" Harrison nodded politely. "Good evening, Veronica." She glanced around the restaurant. Still coming to places like this? Adrian stood beside her now, watching the scene with curiosity. Veronica placed one hand on the back of Harrison's chair. Can you even afford it anymore? Harrison didn't respond. Just then a waiter approached holding a small receipt folder. Sir, he said politely to Harrison, I'm afraid your card didn't go through. The waiter held out the folder. Would you like to try another payment method? The moment hung in the air. Veronica's eyes widened slightly. Then she burst into laughter. Oh my God. Several nearby diners turned their heads. Your card got declined? She laughed even harder. This is priceless. Adrian shifted awkwardly beside her. But Veronica didn't care. She leaned closer to Harrison. You really did lose everything, didn't you? Harrison calmly took out another card and handed it to the waiter. Try this one. The waiter nodded and walked away. Veronica shook her head in disbelief. I almost feel sorry for you. But her smile suggested she felt anything but. She straightened and turned back toward Adrian. Come on, she said. Our table is waiting. As they walked away, Veronica felt a strange thrill of victory. She had taken the house, the money, the lifestyle, and now Harrison couldn't even pay for dinner without embarrassment. In her mind, the war was over. She had won, completely. Across the restaurant, Harrison sat quietly as the waiter returned with the payment receipt. He signed it calmly. Then he glanced briefly at the calendar notification on his phone. The date was circled. He watched the numbers carefully, because while Veronica celebrated her victory, Harrison Clark was doing something far quieter. He was watching the calendar. Chapter 7, The Clock Begins. 3 floors above a quiet financial district in Los Angeles, a small conference room inside a law firm sat completely sealed from the outside world. No windows, no distractions, just a long wooden table and a group of people who understood the power of patience. At the head of the table sat Michael Denton, chairman of the Phoenix Trust Board. He was a thin man in his 60s with silver hair and the calm expression of someone who had spent his entire life dealing with legal structures too complicated for most people to understand. Beside him were 3 other board members and 2 attorneys representing the trust. A thick folder lay open in front of Michael. Across the front page were the words, Phoenix Trust, Ground Lease Expiration Review. Michael adjusted his glasses and looked around the table. Let's confirm the timeline. One of the attorneys, a younger woman named Rachel Monroe, flipped through the documents and nodded. The divorce settlement between Harrison Clark and Veronica Clark is scheduled to finalize tomorrow at 4:00 p.m. Michael nodded. And the ground lease agreements? Rachel slid 2 separate documents onto the table. The Malibu property lease and the Tribeca property lease both expire at midnight tomorrow. One of the board members leaned forward. So roughly 8 hours after the divorce becomes official. Correct. The room remained quiet for a moment. Everyone there understood exactly how unusual the situation was. The Phoenix Trust had been created decades earlier as a sophisticated asset protection structure. Its job was simple: hold ownership of certain high-value land parcels while allowing Harrison Clark's companies to lease and develop them. Normally, when a ground lease approached expiration, negotiations for renewal would begin months in advance. But this time, something was different. Michael tapped the document slowly. And Mr. Clark's instructions? Rachel opened another folder. He has issued a formal directive. She slid the paper across the table. Michael read it silently. Then he nodded. Very well. One of the other board members raised an eyebrow. No renewal? Rachel shook her head. No renewal. The man leaned back in his chair, letting out a quiet whistle. That's going to create a problem for whoever owns the buildings. Michael closed the folder calmly. Yes, he said. It will. Rachel opened another document and began reviewing it aloud. Upon expiration of the lease agreements, the Phoenix Trust will regain exclusive control over the land parcels. She pointed to a clause highlighted in yellow. Any structures remaining on the land without an active lease will be considered unauthorized property usage. Another board member frowned. That means the building owner has 2 options. Rachel nodded. Correct. She lifted 2 fingers. Option 1. Negotiate a new lease at market rates determined by the trust. And option 2. Vacate the property. A quiet laugh escaped one of the attorneys. Good luck moving a mansion. Michael allowed himself a faint smile. Indeed, Rachel turned another page. We've already prepared the initial legal notices. She handed them around the table. Michael read the first one. Notice of lease expiration. The language was formal and precise. The document informed the current property holder that the land lease had expired and outlined the financial consequences of unauthorized occupancy. Michael flipped to the next page. And the financial penalties? Rachel pushed a spreadsheet across the table. These are the projected lease renewal rates if the trust chooses to offer them. Michael studied the numbers carefully. Then he raised an eyebrow. These are substantial. Rachel nodded. The Malibu property alone would require an annual lease payment exceeding several $1,000,000. Another board member chuckled. That's more than some commercial skyscrapers. Rachel continued. And the Tribeca property would be even higher. Michael leaned back in his chair slowly. Has the new property owner been informed? Rachel shook her head. No, one of the attorneys smirked slightly. That's going to be a very unpleasant surprise. Michael closed the folder again. That's not our concern. He folded his hands together. The trust operates according to its legal structure. The board members nodded. Everything being discussed was completely legitimate. The ground leases had always contained expiration clauses. The renewal decision had always belonged to the trust. And now that the divorce settlement had transferred the buildings to Veronica Clark, she would soon discover something very important. She owned the structures, but she did not own the land beneath them. Across the city, however, Veronica was far too busy enjoying her new life to notice anything unusual. At the Malibu mansion, music drifted across the patio as another evening gathering unfolded. Guests laughed around the pool, while servers passed champagne and expensive appetizers through the crowd. Veronica stood near the edge of the terrace in a glittering dress, holding a drink, while Adrian spoke animatedly beside her. You should see the look on people's faces at the tennis club, Adrian said, grinning. Everyone's talking about you. Veronica smiled. Let them talk. They say you walked away with half a billionaire's fortune. She laughed softly. More like most of it. Adrian raised his glass. To winning. She clinked her glass against his. To winning. Across the patio, a group of her friends chatted excitedly. You should host another party next weekend, one of them said. I might, Veronica replied. There's plenty of house to celebrate in. The guests laughed. Veronica looked around at the mansion glowing under the lights. Everything felt perfect. The house, the money, the freedom, and the humiliation she had seen on Harrison's face at the restaurant still made her smile. Somewhere in the distance, waves crashed softly against the Malibu cliffs. Back in the Phoenix Trust office, the board meeting was ending. Michael gathered the final documents into the folder. All notices are ready. Rachel nodded. Yes. Delivery scheduled? Immediately after midnight. Michael stood up from the table. Good. The board members began collecting their briefcases. One of them paused near the door. Does Veronica Clark have any idea what's about to happen? Michael shook his head. None at all. He turned off the conference room lights. Across the city, Harrison Clark sat quietly in the small apartment he now shared with Leo. The room was dim except for a small desk lamp beside him. On the table lay a single calendar. Harrison glanced at the date once more. The final divorce confirmation would arrive tomorrow. He closed the calendar slowly. Outside the window, the city hummed with late-night traffic. Somewhere far away, Veronica Clark was raising another glass of champagne, celebrating her victory. But inside the quiet apartment, Harrison Clark simply waited, because the most important moment had not arrived yet. And once it did, everything would change. For now, there was only one thing left to do. Wait, because the clock was ticking. Chapter 8, Midnight. The clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight. Harrison sat quietly in the dim light of his small apartment, a glass of water in his hand. Leo lay asleep on the pull-out couch, exhausted from a day of unpacking what little they had brought from the Malibu mansion. Outside, the city hummed softly, unaware of the storm about to hit on the other side of town. Harrison's eyes remained fixed on the small digital clock on the nightstand. 11:58 p.m. He exhaled slowly as if each breath carried the weight of the past weeks, the betrayal, the loss of the house, the forced separation from what had once seemed like security. But beneath that weight was something else. Calm. Cold, deliberate calm. He had waited 20 years for this exact moment, and now it was almost here. Meanwhile, across town, Veronica reclined in her silk chaise in the newly redecorated Malibu mansion. The room glittered under the warm glow of modern chandeliers. A half-empty champagne glass rested on the side table. Adrian leaned casually against the bar, laughing at some joke she had told. "I can't believe how easy it's been," Veronica said, her voice dripping with triumph. "Everything I wanted, all mine." Adrian grinned. "You really pulled it off. You're untouchable now." Veronica smiled, swirling her champagne. Untouchable. She had no idea how quickly that illusion was about to shatter. At precisely midnight, a subtle shift occurred in the financial underworld, unnoticed by the world outside. Across the country, the Phoenix Trust's automated systems triggered. Notifications were sent simultaneously to attorneys and agents responsible for the trust properties. The 25-year ground leases under the Malibu mansion and the Tribeca penthouse expired. Technically, the buildings Veronica now owned were sitting on land she did not own. Back at the trust's office, Michael Denon and his team monitored the system. "Timestamp confirmed?" Michael asked. Rachel Monroe, sitting at a bank of monitors, nodded. 11.59.59 now. Leases have officially expired. Michael leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "Good. Send the notices immediately." Within seconds, emails and physical notices were dispatched. Official letters, typed in precise legal language, were delivered directly to the mansion and the Tribeca property. Each notice outlined two urgent options: either negotiate a lease at market rates or vacate the property entirely. Harrison, still seated in the apartment, checked his own phone. A quiet smile formed on his face as he read the automated confirmation that the lease expirations were now legally binding. Miles away, Veronica's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her smile still lingering from earlier. The message preview made her pause. Phoenix Trust, notice of lease expiration. She tapped to open it. Her eyes scanned the text quickly. "Dear Ms. Clark, the ground leases associated with the Malibu mansion and the Tribeca property have expired as of 12 a.m. today. You are hereby notified that without renewal, these properties are considered to be occupying land under the ownership of the Phoenix Trust without authorization. You must either pay the commercial land lease fees outlined below or vacate the premises immediately." She scrolled down, expecting perhaps a modest fee or a routine procedural notice. But her eyes widened as she read the numbers. The annual lease for the Malibu property alone exceeded $12 million. The Tribeca lease? Even higher. Her hand trembled as she put the phone down. This can't be right," she whispered, voice barely audible. Adrian leaned over her shoulder, frowning. "What is it?" Veronica didn't answer at first. She scrolled through the rest of the notice, seeing line after line of fees, penalties, and legal obligations. It wasn't a mistake. Every clause, every figure was accurate and enforceable. "You have to be joking," she said finally, her voice cracking. Adrian took the phone. "These numbers, they're insane. Are you sure this is real?" Veronica's hands shook. "It's real. It has to be real. I sign everything." I thought. Her voice caught. "I thought I had it all." She sank onto the chaise, pressing her head into her hands. For the first time since the divorce, the feeling wasn't triumph. It wasn't victory. It was panic. Adrian placed a hand on her shoulder. "We can fight this. There has to be a way." "No," she snapped, finally looking at him. "You don't get it. I own the buildings, but not the land. If I don't pay these fees, they can legally take them back. Everything, the mansion, the penthouse, it's worthless if I can't afford the leases." She pulled the phone closer, reading the fine print repeatedly. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had overestimated her own power, underestimated the structures Harrison had built, and completely miscalculated the consequences. Across the room, the champagne she had poured herself earlier now sat untouched. It had become meaningless. The laughter, the celebrations, the parties, they were all in the past, all illusions that masked the reality she now faced. Her phone buzzed again. Another notice, this time from the law firm representing the Phoenix Trust, detailed the first steps toward enforcement. Deadlines, eviction procedures, and fines. Every word a dagger. Veronica's hand shook. She sank back against the chaise, staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced through every decision she had made in the past few weeks, the contract she had signed, the art she had ordered, the cars she had driven, the parties she had thrown. Every choice suddenly carried the weight of financial ruin. Veronica? Adrian's voice was quiet now. What do we do? Veronica shook her head. I don't know. For the first time, there was no confidence in her eyes. No charm. No sly grin. Just panic. Outside the mansion, the world remained oblivious. Waves crashed against the shore. Cars drove along the coastal highway. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the house bathed in soft moonlight. But inside, a storm had begun. Far from the mansion, Harrison sat silently in the dim apartment, watching the numbers tick on the digital clock. Midnight had passed. The system confirmation appeared on his phone. Lease expirations. Completed. Notices sent. Confirmed. He set the device down and exhaled slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply waited. Because while Veronica was still trying to comprehend what had just hit her, Harrison Clark knew the real game had only just begun. For the first time, Veronica realized something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. The buildings she believed were hers, symbols of triumph, proof of victory over him, were now liabilities. Massive, crushing financial liabilities. And Harrison had done nothing but wait. The clock had struck midnight, and everything had changed. Chapter 9, The 5 Words. Veronica sat in her marble-lined study, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The papers from the Phoenix Trust lay scattered across the desk, legal notices, spreadsheets, calculations, each one more devastating than the last. Her fingers trembled slightly as she scrolled through the fine print again, unwilling to believe what her eyes were telling her. Adrian hovered behind her, his usually confident expression now tight with worry. Veronica, are you sure these numbers are right? She didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the phone. She needed someone who could make sense of this. Someone who could tell her it was all a mistake. She picked up her phone with trembling hands and dialed Martin Lewis, her divorce attorney, the man who had guided her every step of the way. Martin, she said as soon as he picked up, you need to look at these documents. Now, Veronica. His voice was calm, but there was a subtle undertone of concern. What's wrong? You have to see this. It's insane. Okay. Slow down. Send me the documents. Within minutes, Martin had reviewed the notices, the spreadsheets, and the legal summaries of the Phoenix Trust leases. Veronica paced the study, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Each step echoed like a countdown toward disaster. I'm looking at it, Martin said cautiously, his tone tight. Give me a second. Okay, wait. Veronica stopped pacing and stared at him. What? What is it? Martin's hand went to his forehead. He swallowed hard and looked at her with a pale face. Veronica listened carefully. Her heart raced. Yes. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a near whisper, and then he spoke 5 words that would crush her world. The land was never yours. For a moment, Veronica froze. The words repeated in her head like a hammer striking glass. The land was never yours. Her knees weakened. She sank into the leather chair behind her desk, clutching the edge as though it could anchor her against the tidal wave of reality crashing down. What do you mean? She whispered, though deep down she already feared she knew. Martin hesitated, clearly struggling to find words gentle enough to soften the blow, but accurate enough to convey the truth. The buildings you thought you owned, they're sitting on land legally controlled by the Phoenix Trust. You have no ownership over the land itself, and the trust has no obligation to renew the leases. Veronica shook her head violently. No, that can't be. I signed everything. I bought it. You didn't buy it, Martin interrupted gently. You demanded it in the divorce settlement. And Harrison allowed you to have the buildings because he knew the leases would expire. He structured it so the properties would eventually be worthless to you without renewing the leases. Her hands flew to her face, pressing against her temples as though she could physically stop the realization from spreading. Her chest tightened. The air in the room felt heavier. So, everything I have, the mansion, the penthouse, the cars, the art, it's useless, she said, her voice trembling. Martin nodded slowly. Without land rights, yes. They're technically yours in name, but legally, they're liabilities. The moment the leases expired, those buildings became financial traps. The trust can demand massive lease fees or evict you entirely. Veronica's head fell onto the desk. Papers scattered further as she exhaled sharply, a mix of panic and disbelief. Adrian placed a hand on her shoulder. This can't be happening, she muttered. Adrian's voice was low but tense. We can fight this. Lawyers, there must be a loophole, some way to fix it. Veronica lifted her head slowly, her eyes glassy with shock. No, it's too late. Harrison, he planned this. All of this. Martin spoke again, almost in pity now. Exactly. He let you think you won everything. That's why he agreed to the settlement. It was never about surrendering. It was about controlling the outcome. You took the bait completely. Veronica's mind flashed through the last few weeks. The redecorating, the parties, showing Adrian off in public, flaunting her triumph. The laughter, the champagne, the smug conversations with friends, all of it now felt hollow, ridiculous, a cruel mask for the reality she had ignored. My victory wasn't real, she whispered. No, Martin said softly. It was a trap. You believed you were winning. But in reality, you were stepping into the very disaster Harrison designed for you decades ago. She shook her head, her hands covering her face again. Ow, how could I have been so blind? Martin leaned back, his voice steady but firm. Because you wanted it too much. You wanted the mansion, the penthouse, the cars, more than you wanted to think about the details. You ignored the leases, the trust, everything. And Harrison, he waited. That's the genius of it. Veronica's vision blurred with tears. She could hear Adrian muttering, frustrated and fearful, but she barely registered it. The enormity of her mistake had crushed her world. She looked at Martin, her voice barely audible. So, all the assets, I demanded them. I thought I won. They're not assets. They're liabilities. Financial traps. Everything I worked for, everything I thought I had, yes, Martin confirmed quietly. You believe you're taking his empire? But in truth, the empire is still intact, and you are standing on a ticking financial disaster of your own making. Veronica pressed her hands against her forehead again, gasping slightly. I can't. Martin reached across the desk, placing a calming hand near hers, though he didn't touch her directly. I'm sorry, Veronica. I know this is brutal, but this is reality. There's no way around it. The trust has no obligation to renew the leases. The moment you signed the settlement, you walked straight into the trap. Adrian remained silent beside her, watching the realization settle like a heavy fog. He had been there for all the victories, all the celebrations. Now, all he could do was witness the collapse. Veronica finally lifted her head. Her eyes were wide and frantic, scanning Martin's face as if searching for a lifeline. Tell me this isn't true, she begged. Martin shook his head slowly. I'm afraid it is. Those 5 words, those 5 simple words explain it all. Veronica blinked. Which 5 words? He spoke them again, slowly, deliberately. The land was never yours. The words echoed in her mind. Each syllable struck like a hammer, breaking apart the reality she had built over weeks, over years. In that moment, Veronica understood. Every asset she had demanded, every piece of property, every car, every painting, every dollar she thought she had won, none of it truly belonged to her. Her victory had been nothing more than an illusion. The empire she believed she had stolen was not hers at all. It was a carefully constructed trap, and she had fallen straight into it. Her hands dropped to the desk. She didn't move for a long moment. Outside the windows, the city continued its quiet rhythm, oblivious to the personal disaster unfolding inside the mansion. For the first time since the divorce began, Veronica felt completely, utterly powerless. Her empire had turned into a nightmare. And Harrison, he had already won. Chapter 10, the war was already won. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. The dim light of a single lamp cast long shadows across the small living room. Harrison sat on the edge of the worn couch, hands clasped together, staring at nothing in particular. Across from him, Leo sat cross-legged on the floor, still digesting the events of the past 24 hours. The boy's face was pale, eyes wide and restless. He had spent the day glued to the news, texts, and gossip about his mother's sudden financial crisis. It was chaos, Veronica's empire crumbling while she frantically tried to find a way out. Leo finally broke the silence. "Dad, I don't get it. How? How did she get everything, and now it's all gone?" Harrison leaned back, his expression calm, almost serene. "She didn't get everything, Leo. She got what I wanted her to take." Leo frowned, confusion written all over his face. "I don't understand." Harrison gestured for him to come closer. "Sit down, Leo. It's time you knew the full story." The boy shuffled over and perched on the couch beside him. Harrison's voice was steady, deliberate, each word chosen carefully. 20 years ago, I created something called the Phoenix Trust. It controlled the land underneath several of my most valuable properties, the Malibu Mansion, the Tribeca Building, and a few others. The buildings themselves were mine to give or lease, but the land was held separately. That's what made them so secure. Leo's eyes widened. "So, the houses, the penthouse, they weren't really hers?" "No," Harrison said softly. "She thought they were. But the moment she signed the divorce papers, she stepped into a trap I'd set decades earlier." Leo shook his head slowly. "I can't believe it. She looked so happy, so confident. That's exactly why I let her think she had one," Harrison said, a faint smile appearing. "Sometimes, the key to winning isn't fighting in the moment. Sometimes it's letting your opponent feel like they've taken everything. That way, they're blind to the real outcome." Leo's hands tightened into fists. "All this time, I thought you were weak. I thought you just gave up." Harrison reached out and rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "I gave up nothing, Leo. I only let her believe she had the upper hand. My patience was the weapon." The boy looked down, the weight of understanding settling over him. "So, the houses, the cars, the money, she got what she wanted, but it's all worthless now." "Yes," Harrison said quietly. "Without the land leases, those buildings are nothing but liabilities. And she has no way to change that. She can't force the Phoenix Trust to renew them. The empire she thought she stole, it was never in danger. It was never hers to take." Leo's eyes flicked to the small calendar Harrison had kept on the side table. The date of the lease expirations still circled in red. You planned all this? Even before the divorce?" Harrison nodded. "I've been planning for years, Leo. It wasn't about revenge in the moment. It was about protecting what matters most." Leo's gaze softened, filled with awe and a touch of guilt. "And that's me?" Harrison smiled warmly, ruffling his son's hair. "Yes, you were the only thing I could never let her take. Everything else could be manipulated, controlled, or reclaimed. But you're priceless. And I wasn't going to gamble that for any money or property." The boy leaned against his father, a mixture of relief and pride washing over him. I get it now. You weren't weak. You were playing the long game." Harrison chuckled softly. "Exactly. Sometimes the quietest moves are the most powerful." Leo looked around the small apartment, the worn furniture and modest surroundings suddenly feeling safe and secure. He realized that the luxury, the houses, the cars, none of that mattered if they didn't have each other. "So, she thought she took a kingdom," Leo said after a pause, a hint of amusement creeping into his voice. "But she was really standing on a trap you built." Harrison nodded. "Exactly. Every step she took, every celebration, every smug smile, it all played into my plan. She thought she was winning, but she was never in control. She was walking straight into her own mistake." Leo grinned, a mix of admiration and relief spreading across his face. "Dad, you're incredible. I can't believe it. You never lost." "I never did, Leo," Harrison said, his voice firm but gentle. Sometimes losing a battle is the only way to win the war. And in this case, the war was never about houses or cars or money. It was about protecting what's truly important. Leo leaned back, looking up at the ceiling, letting the weight of the revelation sink in. And we still have each other. Yes, Harrison said, smiling down at him. Always. For the first time in weeks, the tension in the apartment lifted. There was no anxiety, no anger, no fear. Just quiet understanding and a profound sense of security. Harrison stood and walked to the small kitchen, pouring 2 glasses of water. He handed one to Leo and took a sip from his own. You see, Harrison continued, his voice calm, almost philosophical, people measure success by what they take or what they show off. But true victory, true power, comes from patience, strategy, and protecting what cannot be replaced. Money and buildings? They're fleeting. But family, loyalty, and the future, that's eternal. Leo nodded, absorbing every word. So, she thought she destroyed you. But really, you were always 10 steps ahead. Harrison smiled faintly. Always. The room fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence this time. The kind that comes when clarity replaces confusion, when truth replaces fear. Leo looked out the window at the city lights flickering below. She really believed she stole a kingdom, didn't she? Harrison's lips curved in a small, satisfied smile. She did, and that's exactly why it worked. Because the kingdom she thought she owned was never hers to begin with. It was always mine to protect, and I did. The boy leaned back, feeling the weight of the lesson sinking in. And I'm part of that kingdom too. You are, Harrison said softly. More important than all the houses, the cars, the art, more important than any empire she could ever dream of. For a long moment, they simply sat together, father and son, in the quiet apartment that had become their fortress. Outside, the world continued its noisy, chaotic rhythm, but inside, everything felt still, controlled, and right. Harrison reached out and rested a hand on Leo's shoulder again. Remember this, Leo. Some battles are not meant to be fought immediately. Some victories are not meant to be seen by the world. And some wars are won quietly, without anyone even knowing they were happening. Leo smiled, the kind of smile that only comes with true understanding. I get it, Dad. I really do. Harrison leaned back, letting out a deep, satisfied breath. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a small, private sense of triumph. Not because of money or power or revenge, but because the one thing that mattered most was safe, secure, and unbroken. Outside the apartment window, the night air was still, the city lights sparkling like distant stars. Harrison looked at Leo and thought of everything they had endured, everything they had lost and gained. And finally, he felt at peace. Veronica believed she had stolen a kingdom, but in reality, she was standing on a trap Harrison had built decades earlier. And the war had already been won.